Hello friends, welcome back. Let us continue our discussion with emotions and moods. In the previous lecture, I have talked about emotions, I have talked about other aspects of emotions in terms of moral, discussed moral injury, affect, intensity, illusory correlation, emotional labor and dissonance. Today I am going to talk about some theoretical aspects of emotions. So, the first theory is affective events theory developed by Weiss and Copanzo. So, this theory has talked about some negative and positive emotions and how some episodic events tend to trigger or modulate behaviors. So, this theory proposes that employees react emotionally to things that happen to them at work, and these reactions influence their job performance and satisfaction. Any stimulus in the environment at work will trigger emotion, and how the person reacts to that situation emotionally, that is about affective event theory. As the term implies, affective is about emotions and moods, and event at any event that has triggered the emotion of an individual. For example, as it is mentioned on this slide, that when we come to know that the company is downsizing, our emotional reaction will be in form of fear, that maybe I can be fired off. If I am fired, what will I do? From where I will get another job? What will I do for my family? Now, these are the questions that again it will trigger a person emotionally. First emotion is scare or fear of losing the job, and it is leading to another emotion of fear or scare that how he will feed his or her family. So, this is about something which is not in our hands and may feel insecure and fearful and spend much of our time worrying rather than working, and needless to say your job satisfaction will also be down. So, there is an episodic event. The first event is that you have heard that the organization is downsizing. The another emotional reaction to the event is that you are insecure, then it leads to fear, and then it is leading to poor performance. So, the person is trapped in a vicious cycle of emotions. This is all about affective events theory. How it happens? There are factors in the environment which are uncontrollable, which an individual cannot control. It can be in terms of characteristics of the job, it can be about the job demands or requirements for emotional labor. That is, you have to display or fake emotions based on work events such as daily hassles or uplifts, and your personality. Personality factor is very important because how you are reacting to the situation is actually based on your personality, it is distinctive. So, it is about personality and it is about mood. When all these factors combine together, they will resort to the emotional reaction of an individual, that is either positive or negative. In the previous example, when we are talking about the environment, it is about the company is downsizing. When it is about work events, daily hassles or daily uplifts, it is about one fine day you tend to hear that the company is downsizing. About one particular day an event has occurred, and your personality disposition, that is your personality, and personal dispositions, that is your personality and mood. When all these factors combine, it defines an individual's emotional reaction, either it is positive or negative. If it is negative, then definitely the person is feeling insecure, right? And if it is about positive, maybe the person has a positive attitude towards the environment, that maybe I will not be fired or I will get another job. Now, once these kind of emotions are being released from an employee's end, either it lead to job satisfaction or dissatisfaction, and it will have an impact on job performance. So, point is that there are factors in the environment which we cannot control, and at the same time they trigger emotions. How we react or control these emotions, including your personality, will define the emotional reaction, and again it has impact on job satisfaction and job performance. It can lead to either satisfaction or dissatisfaction, or the performance is either enhanced or deterioration. So, this is about the affective events theory of Weiss and Russell. So, how the test of affective events theory suggests? What is the gist? An emotional episode is actually a series of emotional experiences precipitated by a single event and containing elements of both emotions and moods. As I explained, one event that is come to know that the company is downsizing. This will lead to another episodic event, that is you are fearful or insecure. It will again lead to another kind of emotion, and a cycle has been created. Basically, it is an episode of emotion. One emotion is leading to another based on one particular event. So, it is precipitating from one emotion to another by a single event and containing elements of both emotions and moods. Now, once this emotion has been trapped by any situation, it influences the mood. The person is in tense mood, the person is in pensive mood, that what will I do if I lose my job. So, that a person is now in a negative affective state. So, the current emotions influence job satisfaction at a given time along with the history of emotions surrounding the event. Because moods and emotions fluctuate over time, their effect on performance also fluctuates. It is obvious. When you are fearful, when you are insecure, definitely it has negative impact on the job performance, because the focus is somewhere else. The person is in a different mood state. Emotion driven behaviors are typically short in duration and of high variability. The person can also take any inappropriate action or decision once he or she is triggered by that event. Because emotions, even positive ones, tend to be incompatible with behaviors required to do a job, they typically have a negative influence on job performance. Out of excitement also, the person can indulge in taking any wrong decision, and that can have a negative impact on their job performance. So, this is the negative affective state theory, suggesting that one emotional episode actually spurs another emotion, and the person is trapped in that emotional cycle, and how the decision making, job performance and satisfaction is being influenced, either it is positive or negative. Therefore, affective event theory offers two important messages. First, emotions provide valuable insights into how workplace events influence employee performance and satisfaction, and second, employees and managers should not ignore emotions or the events that cause them even when they appear minor, because they accumulate. Here comes the role of the leader, who is relating with every employee or every member of the team, and a small event can trigger emotion. So, leader should be there, should be competent enough to understand the influence of one event on the emotions of the other team members and how to control those emotions. So, these are the two important messages which has been conveyed by this theory, that emotions provide valuable insights into how workplace events influence employee performance and satisfaction, and managers and leaders should not ignore emotions of the events that cause them even when they appear minor, because they accumulate. Now, to understand this message, that how not to ignore the emotions of the managers based on the events, there comes the ability of the manager or the leader to understand one's own emotion and the other members' emotions, and how it can impact the job performance of the employee. So, this is another aspect of emotions, that if any event triggers an emotion and it leads to another emotion in that particular situation, because there is a precipitation of that emotion, then at the same point the manager also needs to understand the emotions. This is another aspect in terms of emotional intelligence, that is a framework to help one's and other person's emotions in a particular situation in order to enhance performance. That is emotional intelligence. If we just go through this example, a CEO of an international talent company who was being observed by his friend, that ultimately the person is very sensitive, he is on a skinny branch where whenever he is triggered, he will either blast on the employee, he is not having the ability to maintain his or control his emotions and the other person's emotions, and he is breaking relationships with every now and then with the employee. This is something that the mood of the CEO is always fluctuating. There is no stability in his emotions, there is no stability in his mood. Sometimes he is happy for a longer period of time, sometimes he is sulking for a longer period of time. So, it is shifting, it is fluctuating. Ultimately, the CEO has failed to notice that her moods have constantly swung towards frustration and exhaustion, and it has impact on job satisfaction, productivity and relationship. That is, they have suffered, the relationship has suffered, the job performance has suffered, and even the productivity of the CEO has also suffered. Worse was that she was too busy to realize the deficiencies until she was completely depleted. And she said that I learned that a leader, you either pay attention to and manage the organization's mood including your own, or you ignore them and pay the price. So, Upshur Luperger learned the value of emotional intelligence. In the end, when everything collapsed, then only the CEO could understand that the worst thing that happened to her was that she was unable to maintain his emotions and the other person's emotions, which collapsed the whole system while affecting job satisfaction, productivity and relationships. So, this is the drawback of the CEO, that he failed to understand that how emotions are important to be controlled, not only ours but the other person's emotions, and if they are not being controlled or they are being completely ignored, then the organization has to pay the price. So, the point is based on this example that emotion is an inseparable aspect of work life. Even the workload is high, it has some emotional impact on an individual. So, how that emotion has to be controlled or understood, that ability has to be there or developed among individuals, so that the disastrous consequences should not be met by the organization. The another example was of Diane Marshall, who is an office manager and her awareness of her own and others' emotion is almost nil. That means that he has no understanding of his own emotions and others. The manager is moody and unable to generate much enthusiasm and interest in her employees. She does not understand why employees get upset with her, and she often overreacts to problems and chooses the most ineffectual response to emotional situations. Now, when the manager is incapable to respond appropriately emotionally, then definitely it has negative influence on the co-worker as well, and ultimately the relationship breaches. That means Diane has low emotional intelligence, that is for sure, because even when the manager is not understanding what he or she is feeling and how he should react to those emotions, then it has a negative impact on the other person. That is emotional intelligence. So, how to define it? It is a very heavy term, it carries lot of significance at workplaces. So, emotional intelligence, which has its acronym as EI, is a person's ability to perceive emotions in self and others, understand the meaning of these emotions and regulate one's emotions. When your emotions are regulated, the other person's emotions also get regulated at the same time. So, there is regulation. Emotional intelligence or EQ, it is also known as emotional quotient. Like IQ, it is intelligence quotient, IQ, then we have emotional intelligence or emotional quotient, that is EQ. It refers to the capacity for recognizing our own feelings and those of others, for motivating ourselves and for managing emotion well in ourselves and in our relationships. It is the ability of individuals to recognize one's own and others' emotions, to discriminate between different feelings and label them appropriately, and use emotional information to get one's own and others' thinking and behavior. So, in order to understand one's and other person's emotions, it also becomes very important to gather all the emotional information or the sources which has led to that particular emotional state, in order to understand one's and other person's emotional state and respond to those situations in an emotionally appropriate manner. This is a cascading model of emotional intelligence, that is conscientiousness. When we are conscious, when we have enough emotional information, it leads to perceived emotions in self and others. When we have enough appropriate knowledge, emotional information about oneself and others, we become more conscious that what are the factors that has pushed two people in a different emotional state. The other is cognitive, that is understanding the meaning of emotions. Once we have all the emotional information, it becomes very easy to contemplate, to interpret the emotional states, that why and how it is happening. And the last is emotional stability. Once we have enough information and we have enough understanding of the emotions, then it becomes very easy to regulate those emotions and then responding to the situations in a very appropriate manner. So, it is a cascading model, that is, first we perceive that some emotional reaction will take place, then we have all the appropriate information and then responding to the situations. So, conscientiousness, cognitive and emotional stability goes hand in hand when we talk about emotional intelligence. But why it is important? As I mentioned just now, that it makes a significant aspect of work life. Why? Because it leads to improved relationship and conflict resolution, because when we have all the information of understanding emotions and how to respond to it, then the conflict gets resolved. Savor success and adequate leadership. Definitely, if any leader is able to understand the emotion of one's and others while having all the information, then the leader is effective, influential and adequate. Improved physical health and mental well-being, enhanced job performance, enhanced team effectiveness and citizenship behaviors, and reduced deviant behaviors. Without having any understanding of emotions about oneself and others, definitely the action can have some detrimental consequences. But if understanding is there, then the action is always constructive rather being destructive or deviant. So, a study looked at the success and failures of 11 US presidents based on some emotional qualities, and they identified 6 emotional qualities, that is communication, organization, political skill, vision, cognitive style and emotional intelligence. It was found that the key quality that differentiated the successful and unsuccessful leaders such as Roosevelt, Kennedy and Reagan. They were successful leaders because they scored high on having appropriate communication with the members. They were good at organizing the emotions of oneself and others. They had more political skill, that means to be more diplomatic. They had a vision how to take forward the whole team. They have better understanding or vocabulary of the emotions and intelligence. And those leaders who were unsuccessful, they had very low emotional intelligence or very weak understanding of emotions that marked them as unsuccessful leaders. That is why emotional intelligence plays a very important role at workplaces, because every time, no matter what kind of policy or procedure we implement in any organization, it has some emotional influence on employees, and how employees will respond emotionally to those policies, practices and procedure, that will define more heavily, that is on emotional basis. So, in 1983, Howard Gardner introduced multiple intelligences, which included both interpersonal and intrapersonal intelligence. Interpersonal intelligence talked about the capacity to understand the intentions, motivations and desires of other people. And intrapersonal intelligence defined the capacity to understand oneself, to appreciate one's feelings, fears and motivations. It is about oneself and others. Now, this interpersonal and interpersonal intelligence was again reframed, was proposed in another framework by Goldman, that is emotional intelligence. He has used this concept of interpersonal and intrapersonal intelligence in a new framework, that is emotional intelligence, in a widely famous book titled as Emotional Intelligence, Why It Can Matter More Than IQ. So, based on this model of emotional intelligence, a number of models have been proposed by different psychologists. The first was developed by Peter Salovey and John Mayer, and this model outlines 5 main emotional intelligence constructs such as perceiving emotion, facilitating thought using emotion, understanding emotions and managing emotions. So, they have identified the understanding of emotions based on 4 parameters. The other model, the first model was the ability based model developed by Peter Salovey and Mayer. The other was the trait model developed by Konstantinos V. Petrides in the year 2001, and this model was away from Salovey and Mayer's model, where they identified that emotional intelligence is a constellation of emotional self perceptions which is located at the lower levels of personality and integrates the affective aspects of personality. So, according to Petrides, he has proposed that emotional intelligence is a part of personality which is constructed at the lower level. It is very different from the conceptualization of Salovey and Mayer. Whereas, Goldman developed a mixed model. He developed a model which outlines 5 constructs of emotional intelligence: self-awareness, self-regulation, social skill, empathy and motivation. This was a novel framework, and the other was developed by Baron and Parker. This model comprises 5 interrelated emotional and social competencies such as interpersonal stress management, adaptability and general mood. So, these are the 4 models of emotional intelligence which are very much widely used in organizations to understand and identify emotions of employees and how to develop understanding of emotions and have a better IQ of emotion, that is EQ. So, we will go into detail about the ability based model developed by Mayer and Salovey and Caruso in 1997, and they identified EI as the ability to engage in sophisticated information processing about one's own and others' emotions and use this information as a guide to thinking and behavior. So, the point is, in order to identify one's and others' emotions will help to streamline the behavior and thinking process of two people and come to an appropriate decision making. So, it includes the abilities to accurately perceive emotions, access and generate emotions so as to assess thought, to understand emotions and emotional knowledge, and reflectively regulate emotions so as to promote emotional and intellectual growth. This is a model which has identified the 4 factors of emotional intelligence by Mayer, Salovey and Caruso, that is perceiving emotions, using emotions, managing emotions and understanding emotions. So, how to perceive emotions? What is this kind of ability that Mayer has talked about? It is the ability to identify emotion in one's physical states, feelings and thoughts. It is ability to identify emotions in other people, designs, artwork, etc. through language, sound, appearance and behavior. It is ability to express emotions accurately to and express needs related to those feelings. And last is to ability to discriminate between accurate and inaccurate expressions of feelings. Now, the point is that any person can have more inclination to perceive emotions. One person can have more inclination in using emotions of oneself and others. So, any person can just bank upon only one aspect of EI while maybe scoring low on the other aspects. So, it depends on an individual discretion. Maybe that one person can weigh heavily upon facilitating emotions, that is on this subdimension of EI, where it promotes emotions, prioritize thinking by directing attention to important information. They are sufficiently vivid and available that they can be generated as aids to judgment and memory concerning feelings. It is based on emotional mood swings, change the individual's perspective from optimistic to pessimistic, encouraging consideration of multiple points of view, and emotional states differentially encourage specific problems approaches. So, this is an individual's discretion that he is more inclined to facilitate emotions of oneself and others, or the one person can have more inclination towards perceiving emotions of oneself and others in different way. So, he has ability for all, but maybe has more inclination for one construct. The other is understanding emotions, that is ability to label emotions and recognize relations among the words and the emotions themselves, such as relation between liking and loving, ability to interpret the meaning that emotions convey regarding relationships, ability to understand complex feelings, that is simultaneous feelings of love and hate or blend such as awe, such as combination of fear and surprise. So, this is an individual's understanding of emotional feelings based on some expressions, and ability to recognize likely transitions among emotions. And the fourth construct is managing emotions of oneself and others, that is ability to stay open to feelings, both those that are pleasant and are unpleasant. So, any person can bank upon this aspect of EI while managing one's and others' emotions and understanding the pleasant and unpleasant emotion of oneself and others. The other is ability to reflectively engage or detach from an emotion depending upon its judged informativeness or utility. Maybe any information is useful, the person will try to manage the person's emotions, or else the person will try to dilute those emotions. Ability to reflectively monitor emotions in relation to oneself and others, and ability to manage emotion in oneself and others by moderating negative emotions and enhancing pleasant ones without repressing or exaggerating information that they may convey. These are the 4 factors of emotional intelligence given by Mayer, Salovey and Caruso, that how any individual can be able or can develop the ability to understand emotions based on these 4 factors, and any individual can have more inclination only for one factor and maybe less for the other 3 factors. But ultimately the focus will be on oneself and others. So, this is about Mayer, Salevo and Caruso's ability based model of emotional intelligence. Rest models we will continue in the next discussion, followed with Constantinos, Daniel Goleman and Baron and Parker. Thank you so much.